All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the book Bible study from the Trimmed and Burning Bible Study, where we are now in 2 Samuel. And of course, I don't think we have any new people in here today, but of course, we're studying God's Word as one story through one family, looking at the 66 book library and how it tells a story. And I still think every time I think about it, it's fascinating. That imagine just going to the library, finding all these books on the shelves, and they tell one story, and the authors never met. That's how the Bible is, and that's what's pretty amazing about it. And that's how you know God is a true author. So if somebody ever tells you, which you'll hear all the time, that man wrote the Bible, theoretically their hands, put the ink on the paper, but the Holy Spirit wrote it, because there's no other way that this could be so organized. And it's amazing. Then once you start analyzing the text, you can see God's fingerprints all over it. But of course, we are in the history books again, and I love to tell people, if you weren't here before in the past, that if you understand the history books, you understand the books of Moses and the history books all the way through Esther here, you'll understand the biblical narrative of the Old Testament, what was going on before the intertestamental period, that 400-year gap where Greece, came in. You don't really read much about them there. So it's really important. Once you understand that, like I said, the prophets and everything else kind of fits into that narrative, and you can understand it. But of course, we are in the 10th book of the Bible now. We've done Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, now in 2 Samuel in the Bible here. Now just, again, a quick recap. Again, get our heads in the game of what happened at the end of 1 Samuel. Remember, David left and ran to the Philistines, which is really crazy to us, that he went and lived among the enemies of the Lord. Didn't just visit, lived, had a town living there. So, pretty wild thing. And he went there, and Achish accepted him. And by the way, if you remember, he had gone there before and had to pretend he was crazy, because back then it was a little more hostile. So this was his actually second visit to Achish, the king of the Philistines. And Achish gladly took him in this time. And then, of course, we learned how David had Achish give him a town, Ziklag, and he used that down on the borders, out of Achish's vision, basically, where Achish would have to travel down there to see what's going on. And he was keeping his men taken care of by plundering, but he was actually killing the enemies of Israel, not the enemies of Philistines. So he's kind of a double agent, right? In a way, he's a double agent living among the Philistines, pretending to be a Philistine, and pretending to have left Israel and abandoned it because Saul was after him and to kill him, which they knew that. But really, he was also helping Israel at the same time, sort of like I said, as a double agent, which is pretty cool. And then that final battle, which it carried into even last week, Saul heard the Philistine army was going to attack, and this is while David was still with the Philistines, right? And Saul was afraid, he's outnumbered, the Philistines were big and powerful, and the reason he was really afraid is because God was not answering Saul. As we know, Saul had been walking away further and further from God. The Spirit of the Lord had left him a long time ago, and he didn't know what to do. He got panicked, so he went, and we had that crazy story about the medium, where he learned, basically, this is a really important story, not so much about mediums and necromancers and all that stuff, although it's, a component of it, but this is where he got the prophecy of his death. This is the day before he died, and Samuel's spirit, the one time the Lord allowed him to come up and say, Saul, because you did this, I'll see you tomorrow. And Saul knew exactly what that meant. And then, of course, the Philistines, again, the saga picked right back up to where the Philistines were marching up to fight with Saul. And it's just hard for our minds to imagine that David was marching with the Philistines up north. And sometimes I think about, what was David thinking? Was he that far gone that he was ready to fight Israel? Was he thinking about how he was going to turn on him when he got there? I don't know. But the Lord knew we didn't even want to see it happen. So the Lord works this out. This is divine intervention, where the Philistine, basically their generals, their war generals, essentially said, I don't trust this David. You got to get him out of here because he could turn against us, which I think he probably would have in the end if it came to it. And he saw Jonathan over here and his Philistine buddies here. I think he would have, joined up. But we won't know because God didn't make that happen. And Achish was upset because Achish liked David. And David was a mighty warrior, as we know. He killed Goliath and many, many more than that. He was a really dominant warrior. So Achish was kind of bummed, but said, hey, these are my trusted generals. You're going to have to go home. And David was actually upset about it. He'd never been rejected before. And then, of course, when he got back, Ziklag, the town where all of his families, the wives and the children were staying while the men of war went out, had been destroyed by the Amalekites. It was all on fire, and all the women and the children were gone, which, talk about a panic attack. And it could have been awful, but the Lord protected them. The Lord protected those women and those children, which is unusual for a situation like this. When people come and plunder a city, usually everybody goes, right? So this is God's, again, divine hand. You can see it all throughout how God is divinely protecting David, leading David, because otherwise David would get himself in trouble. But David did he went and defeated the Amalekites. he went and found the women and the children, and not one of them was harmed. They were all safe again. So again, that was God's hand on everything, and they end up getting all their plunder and being all right there. And then, of course, 1 Samuel 31 ended with Saul and his sons being killed on Mount Gilboa, got hit with the archer, and then we have the whole saga about Saul, whether he got stabbed twice or 3 times. That was the debate, but he ends up dying up there on Mount Gilboa. And then, of course, the men, this will come into play today, the men of Jabesh Gilead rescued and honored Saul's body, and Saul had helped Jabesh Gilead earlier in the book of 1 Samuel. So out of honor, they did this, which sounds crazy to us because they're already dead, right? And the Philistines are hanging their bodies and, all this stuff. And it would have been very dangerous, but they did it just to honor Saul's body. They went and retrieved his head, retrieved his body, and went and gave him proper care for that. And then last week, this is where we were last week, 2 Samuel 1, David now had found out. It had been a couple days, it said, after he got back from Ziklag, probably feeling better. Imagine the emotional roller coaster. He was marching up north to fight Israel, got rejected, he's all upset, goes back, finds his towns burnt, goes and finds his women, saves them, is all happy, comes back and then found out his best friend had died. So talk about a bad week, right? David had a bad week. But he hears, of course, from this young Amalekite man that we learned. He came up and said, hey, here's his crown, here's Saul's crown, here's his bracelet, he's dead. I actually had to go and help kill him because he was still alive and he asked me to kill him, right? Thinking he did the right thing probably. And David has so much respect for God, right? And says, you don't mess with God's plan. God will decide. You don't touch God's anointed. Even though it's crazy, it's like, well, David, he did you a favor. Saul was trying to murder you over and over. Isn't that kind of justice? David didn't see it that way. David saw it in the right way, that God will have justice. God will take care of this. And because of that, he actually killed the Amalekite. And I talked about how interesting it was, and I do believe that the Amalekite was not making up the story, but he did kill Saul because of poetic justice, because the whole reason Saul had an issue and really lost his kingship, one of the final straws, was that he did not wipe out all the Amalekites. So because of that, Amalekite, although he asked them to, it's kind of a poetic justice thing where that ended up literally being the death of him. It was the death of Saul. And then, of course, ripped their clothes, out of sign for anguish and mourning. And then David wrote this beautiful song for Saul and Jonathan, where he didn't bash Saul. He didn't overdo it for Jonathan and say, yeah, Saul was great, but Jonathan was awesome. No, he gave them all this great praise and honor, talked about how great Saul was, how great Jonathan was, how great of friends they were. Because remember, they had that special bond because usually Jonathan would have had to rise to be king if he would have survived, which I think, again, as sad as it sounds, this is probably God's divine hand. And you'll see why maybe in this chapter might make a little bit more sense. But otherwise, if Saul would have been dead and Jonathan would have lived, even if Jonathan and David won, they had a covenant. So they were going to be friends, but there would have been people on the outside encouraging other things. So I think God in his divine wisdom took Jonathan with him. And that's how last week had ended. And now we're going to go ahead and jump in, read 2 Samuel chapter 2. So you can turn your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 2. And we'll go ahead and read verse by verse, and then just do a little breakdown here on everything. All right. 2 Samuel chapter 2. After this, David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. David said, to which shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. So David went up there, and his 2 wives also, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David brought up his men who were with him, everyone with his household, and they lived in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. When they told David, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul, David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, may you be blessed by the Lord, because you showed this loyalty to Saul your Lord and buried him. Now may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you, and I will do good to you, because you have done this thing. Now therefore, let your hands be strong and be valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and he made him king over Gilead, and the Asherites, and Jezreel, and Ephraim, and Benjamin, and all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Abner the son of Ner and the servants of Ishbosheth the son of Saul went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab the son of Zeruiah and the servants of David went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. And they sat down, the one on the one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. And Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men arise and compete before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." Then they arose and passed over by number, 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. And each caught his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so they fell down together. Therefore that place was called Helkath Hazarim, which is at Gibeon. And the battle was very fierce that day. And Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. And the 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was as swift of foot as a wild gazelle. And Asahel pursued Abner. And as he went, he turned neither to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. Then Abner looked behind him and said, "Is it you, Asahel?" And he answered, "It is I." Abner said to him, "Turn aside to your right hand or to your left, and seize one of the young men and take his spoil." But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. And Abner said again to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab?" But he refused to turn aside. Therefore Abner struck him in the stomach with the butt of his spear, so that the spear came out his back. And he fell there and died where he was. And all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner. And as the sun was going down, they came to the hill of Ammah, which lies before Giah, on the way to the wilderness of Gibeon. And the people of Benjamin gathered themselves together behind Abner and became one group and took their stand on the top of a hill. Then Abner called to Joab, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that the end will be bitter? How long will it be before you tell your people to turn from the pursuit of their brothers?" And Joab said, "As God lives, if you had not spoken, surely the men would not have given up the pursuit of their brothers until the morning." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the men stopped and pursued Israel no more, nor did they fight any more. And Abner and his men went all that night through the Arabah. They crossed the Jordan, and marching the whole morning they came to Mahanaim. Joab returned from the pursuit of Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, there were missing from David's servants 19 men besides Asahel. But the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin 360 of Abner's men. And they took up Asahel and buried him in the tomb of his father, which was at Bethlehem. And Joab and his men marched all night, and the day broke upon them at Hebron. All right, so a lot goes on in that chapter. One that not everybody's super familiar with, so this will be really fun to break this story down. So the first 7 verses here is where David, we see, is anointed the king of Judah. Now, I like how it starts. Because after this, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?" And then the Lord tells him to go up, right? And then look at this. After he asks that, he asks another question, "To which shall I go up?" And the Lord tells him Hebron. So I think this is really important, because you got to remember, it's been chapters halfway through the book of 1 Samuel, essentially. David was anointed king. Remember, it's about 20 years since he was first anointed king privately, right? So he knows he's going to be king. And he had to deal, that's why he dealt so patiently with Saul. He believed the Lord's promises that he was going to be king. However, when Saul dies, so now Saul's dead, Jonathan's dead, all his sons on Mount Gilboa are dead, but you don't see David say, "All right, thanks God, now's my cue, I got it, I'm king now." And you think like most of us probably would be like, "All right, well, Saul's dead, here I go, let's start taking over." But you see here why David is a man after God's own heart. Even though God had promised him and he knew it was the plan, he's asking God, is it time yet? So sometimes God will have promises for your life, but it's all about timing and let it play it out in the right time. Do not rush things, right? Because David asks him right here and shows the obedience to asking God. And when he asks him, should he go to the cities of Judah? He's saying, should I go now? Is it time for me to be king over Judah? And the Lord tells him, yeah. And when he does that, I love it. David doesn't say, all right, I'm going to go to Judah. He says, where at in Judah should I go? And from this, I think it's really cool to see that David is teaching us that we can ask specific questions. You continually pray. Don't be so hasty in making decisions. And he's really relying on the Lord here. And he tells him to go to Hebron, which is where David ends up going. And of course, you see there's a Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, if you remember her, she was the wife of Nabal. There's that whole story about Nabal in 1 Samuel there, where David took her as a wife, so she comes back into play there. But they went to Hebron. Now, go back, I don't always do this, but go back to Genesis 13. Genesis chapter 13. Let's see where we want to go. Let's see. Let's go to Genesis 13, 14. Go to verse 14, and we'll just read verses 14 through 18. Yeah, Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 through 18. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever." So this is what God shows Abraham, all the land he's going to give him. "I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. So the reason I wanted to go there, we can go back to 2 Samuel 2 now, is that's when God promises Abraham. You see, he's promising the land. He's going to take this land, and the first place he sends him to is to Hebron. That's literally where Abraham started his whole journey there after God tells him that. So this is connecting David to the promises of Abraham. Those promises of Abraham having all that land, by God sending to Hebron, I think there's a reason. God just doesn't do things, well, he doesn't throw darts at the board and say where we're going to go this week, right? He sent him to Hebron for a reason. He was continuing that pattern. And David, I'm sure, knew this. This is where Abraham was after God had told him about the promised land. So he's tying David here to the promises of Abraham that God was continually carrying out. And we'll see in a couple of chapters how he gives the Davidic covenant then as well and continues that on. But I wanted to point that out. It's interesting that he sends him to Hebron, right? And that's where the term, obviously, the Hebrews comes from. They were from Hebron. And this is where David goes. It said that David brought up his men who were with him, everyone in his household, and they lived in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. Another interesting thing, you could ask yourself, wasn't David already anointed? Yeah, he was already anointed. But it's showing again, that was a private anointing. Now this is a public anointing, right? Because remember, not everybody saw that anointing. Saul never even saw that. That was before that, right? So now this is a public anointing to show God had already anointed him privately, right? And nobody knew that. Now it's a public declaration here. That's why the anointing is happening here again, right? So you can maybe kind of think of it's not the same, but imagine if you got baptized just like you and your family in your basement or something, a little pool. But then you did it outside in front of a church, right, to do a public declaration. This is more of a public announcement here that David was finally going to be the king over the house of Judah. And that's what happens there in those first 7 verses, which is pretty cool. Now, these next 4 verses, we see this man named Ishbosheth pop into the story. So, there's still more up. I jumped ahead a little bit here. I want to go back up to verse 4 and 5. When they told David it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul, David sent messengers to men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, "May he be blessed by the Lord because you showed his loyalty to Saul your Lord and buried him." So what's really cool here, I didn't want to skip over this part, is you see David finds out about those men, Jabesh Gilead, at the end of chapter 31. Sometimes you think these little things like, well, that was a really random thing to mention. They buried their bodies out, whatever. But a lot of times things in the Bible come into play in other areas. For example, there's a whole storyline of Jabesh Gilead. You can go back and watch how Saul helped them earlier on in 1 Samuel. That's why they have this loyalty. Why would these people bury his body? Well, Saul helped them in the past, and they're loyal to him. So now you have David. He had talked really nice about Saul. And now he's honoring these guys from Jabesh Gilead, saying, you showed loyalty to Saul, your Lord, and buried him. May the Lord show his steadfast love and faithfulness to you. I will do good to you because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant. The Lord is dead. Saul, your Lord, is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. So it's really smart again. David is a really good political leader, not only a military leader. He's a good political strategist. Because remember, Saul died, and he could have made it all about to death to Saul and all his house, and it could have been really awful and a lot of war and chaos. But he didn't. Instead, he's consolidating power. He knows Saul's not a threat anymore. And Jabesh Gilead were loyalists to Saul. So if David isn't careful and he comes up as king, perhaps Jabesh Gilead would say, on behalf of Saul, we're going to stick with Ishbosheth, which will come up later. But he doesn't. And he says, at the end of this, he honors them. Like, hey, that was really honorable of you guys. What you did for Saul, that's so awesome. I love Saul. He's a great king. That's so honorable. May the Lord bless you. Hey, guys, by the way, I'm going to be king over Judah. So, hey, just get ready for that, okay? So he's almost like gradually, shaking their hands. Like, hey, I'm the new king, but I loved your king. Let's be friends. It's almost like a little bit of a political alliance to make sure that the men of Jabesh Gilead are loyal to David as just like they were to Saul, letting him know that basically the baton has been passed to me, guys. But that was really great what you did, right? So I think you see a lot of wisdom here, a lot of political wisdom from David here that the Lord certainly has given him. Now we can go to this section here with Ishbosheth. So it says, but Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and he made him king over Gilead and the Asherites and Jezreel and Ephraim and Benjamin and all Israel. So what's interesting here, remember, Abner is the commander of Saul's army. So he's basically his war's general, right? And Abner had to have known by now, because it's no secret, that David was going to be king. Even before Saul died, Abner is his main general, so he knows the whole reason Saul wants to kill David. He's jealous of David. He doesn't want David to be king. Saul's the king. And it's kind of like one of those things. Abner probably saw the writing on the wall. Well, if my boss is dead and there's a new boss, I'm going to lose my job. And I don't want to lose my job because I kind of like my job and I have a lot of power and a lot of money and a lot of wealth. I'm in charge of a lot of things. And if this David guy becomes in charge, my life's going to be ruined. And I like how I'm living now. So that's what's really going on here. He puts this man Ishbosheth, which again we don't really learn about until now, this Saul's son. And this is another pattern in the Bible, by the way, you'll notice, good or bad. Like Saul was kind of evil, right? But even then, he had a remnant. So sometimes you'll see they'll try to wipe out an entire family, and there'll be a remnant there. Even if you go back to, I think it was Abimelech in Judges, he tries to kill all the sons, and there's one remaining. So you see that pattern even here. A 40-year-old man named Ishbosheth was Saul's son. And Abner sees the moment because I know one of his sons, Ishbosheth. I'm going to go get him. We'll make him king. And he installs him king over Israel, the north. So now a civil war has broken out, which is a sign of what's to come. Because we know there will be a bigger civil war later with Jeroboam or Rehoboam, and it's going to be more chaos. But this is another civil war going on here. Israel and Judah are separated. They're no longer united, and Ishbosheth's in charge. But what Abner's doing here is proving us the foolishness of man, right? The foolishness of man to think that God said something, but you can outdo it. It's actually satanic, because Satan does the same thing. Satan knows what God said, and he knows that Christ said it's all done, but he wants to just wreck and wreak havoc for his own good, and that's what Abner's doing here. Abner's fighting against God just like Saul did. He's just following after his boss, Saul, basically, which will end. We'll see how it goes later. We learn here again, Ishbosheth's 40, and he reigned for 2 years. I think that's really important, because we can read these chapters and just go chapter by chapter by chapter, and in our mind, it just happened one day after another day. But after he installs him as king, it goes for 2 years. Now again, think about David. David has been anointed. He was anointed 20 years ago, right? And he had to be the shepherd boy, and he followed the Lord and had to live under Saul and his chaos and run, and Saul's finally dead, and I'm sure he was like, he breathed a sigh of relief, like, finally, I'll be king. But for 2 years, he has like a whole other situation arise. And I bet at some point in his humanness, doesn't say it, but he's probably like, God, when is this happening? You keep kicking the can down the road. Are we actually doing this or not, right? So it shows that sometimes you have to be patient. God will make you promises, but you have to be patient. Also, we're learning here that God's plan happens in steps, in sequence. It doesn't always happen from here to boom, and now God's plan's here. No, it slowly unfurls. David's anointed as a young man. Then all of a sudden he beats Goliath, gains a little bit of power, a little bit of notoriety. Then he survives Saul, builds his character, all these things. And now he has to go through another 2-year war with Ishbosheth and Israel. So kind of a hectic beginning too. Although he's king, he's only partially king. And what's amazing here is, remember, Jesus Christ is in all of the scriptures. And you can see his story here. Because just like today, is Jesus king? Yes, he's king. Is the kingdom here on earth? Yeah, it's here, but not yet. You ever heard that? Like it's right now, but not yet. That's how the kingdom is. The kingdom is living through us. Jesus is reigning as king, but it's only partial, right? Because you see the world governments and what they're doing. They're not living very godly. But eventually, it'll be fully here. The kingdom will be completely here. He'll reign over everybody, not just in our hearts and not just through believers, but it'll reign throughout the entire earth. So it's another sign that God does things in these waves. And sometimes it's here, but not completely here yet. And you see that even here with David. And the greater king than David is Jesus Christ. And his kingdom is unfolded the same exact way, which is really, really interesting in steps and processes. And that's what Peter and all them had a problem with, right? They were ready for it to just, God made a promise, kingdom's coming, and it's here, right? It's like, nope, God says you got to be patient. You have to wait another couple thousand years. And things are going to have to unfold slowly but surely. This is a process, and trust the process, trust the plan. And that's what David's doing here. But he has to be patient. I just want to point out, 2 years he had to deal with this. It was not like a 1-week war, a 1-month war. 2 years he had to fight with Israel. And it does say, it could confuse you because it says, when David was king of Hebron for 7 years and 6 months, so 7.5 years. So the disparity there. All that means is that he stayed in Hebron after those 2 years for another 5.5 years. He kept the capital there at Hebron. But now, after this section is where we have, this is the rest of the book, the Battle of Gibeon. This is the one that's lesser known to a lot of people. So it starts out, Abner, goes out to Gibeon, and Joab is the war general of David, right? That's his nephew, actually, of Zeruiah. That's David's sister. And they go out and they meet at the pool of Gibeon. So Joab and his guys are over here. Abner and his guys across like these waters from one side, talking like from a pool to the other side, right? And they sit down, one on the one side, one on the other side. And Abner says to Joab, Saul's guy says to David's guy, let the young men arise and compete before us. And Joab agrees. So remember, this is kind of a thing. It was like fighting by proxy they used to do. This is how we got the whole David and Goliath story. Do you ever think about that? Why was everybody watching on the hill from Israel? Why was everybody on the Philistines watching while just David and Goliath fought? Why weren't they all fighting each other? Because this is what they did. This is how they fought battles back then. So this time, instead of 1-on-1, they're going to do 12-on-12, which is really interesting. There's plenty more men there, I'm sure. But they take the young men, which is really sad, young men and the warriors, and he says, yeah, let's let them do it. It says, so they arose and passed over by number 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 the servants of David. And look what happens. Each caught his opponent by the head. So they all at the same time grab each other by the head. They all take their knives and simultaneously, kill each other, right? They stab each other with the sword into their opponent's side, and they fall down together, which is, they renamed the whole place because of this. Place of the sword, battle of the sword, there's all kinds of names for it. But basically, it says the battle was very fierce that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. But this is how it all starts out. It starts out 12-on-12, and immediately they wipe each other out. Imagine the David and Goliath story. Instead of David being Goliath simultaneously threw a spear through David as he killed Goliath. What would happen? I don't know, the war would have continued on, I guess. But it's sad, and it shows how futile and foolish wars can be. Because Joab and Abner didn't have to risk their lives. They didn't die. They sent 12 young men of each side out, and they all died. It shows that it accomplishes nothing, right? These wars and these hand-to-hand combats and killing accomplish nothing for anybody. They're a stalemate again. The only thing is 24 men are dead. For what, right? For foolish pride. Because if Abner would have just listened to the Lord, they would have put their arms down, and they would have joined forces with David. Because think about this. How bad is this? Abner's not from the Philistia. He is an Israelite. So these are God's people fighting. This whole war we're reading about here, this Battle of Gibeon, is God's people fighting God's people, right? Which is interesting because you see that in the church today, don't you? You see that in Christians fighting each other and having these wars with each other and whose church is what. And inside churches, they're warring and they're fighting. God hates that stuff. And this is what happens. It shows that it's worthless. It's futile when this happens. Nothing good happens from infighting in the house of God. That's what we see here. And they just have to start from scratch. They're just down some people now. People just got hurt. They got mortally wounded, right? And then it says the battle was fierce that day. So the battle continued on. And we do see that Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. So David's men ended up winning this war. But we learn a little bit more here when you get to verse 18. So it said 3 sons of Zeruiah were there. Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. So these are David's nephews. Again, Zeruiah is David's sister. So these are his nephews. Joab's his war general, but he's got 2 other brothers, Abishai and Asahel. And they seem to be pretty good warriors as well. We learned, it says, Asahel was as swift of foot as a wild gazelle. Mainly, he was maybe David's fastest warrior. If this is a cross-country team, he was going to be the sprinter. He was going to be the guy out in front that they would give, all their glory to win the matches. So Asahel is the fastest one. He's super fast, and he's going to use this speed. The reason it talks about this is because he's going to use his speed to catch Abner. Look what it says. And Asahel pursued Abner. He's chasing him. And as he went, he turned neither to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. I mean, laser focused. This guy's just running through the woods, running through everything, and he's got his eyes on Abner, and he's not distracted by anything. He's not going to let anything distract him. He's speeding, down this wherever they're at, and he's pursuing them. And then it says, Abner looked behind him and said, is that you? Is it you, Asahel? So you can imagine, he's sprinting. He knows he's being chased by somebody from David's army, but he doesn't know who it is. He turns around, and he's like, oh, that's Asahel. I know Asahel. That's Joab's brother. Because, of course, the generals know each other, right? They just talked about to each other on the pool at the pool of Gibeon. So I'm sure Asahel and Abishai were sitting right there. But Asahel is so mad about this war and what's going on. He's so loyal to David, he just wants to kill and take out Abner. He says, is it you, Asahel? And Asahel says, it is I. Abner said to him, turn aside to your right hand or to your left and seize one of the young men and take his spoil. Now, this is really interesting. He's basically like, kill one of my guys. Don't come after me. Turn to the right to the left, because it said he did not turn to the right to the left. He was focused on Abner. So what Abner is saying, if you really want to take vengeance, if you're all angry and wrought up, you want to kill somebody else. Don't come fight me, Asahel. I don't want it and you don't want it. Go find another guy and take his spoil. You can have his money, you can have his swords, whatever you got, whatever his treasures he's got, and go home. Just stop now. But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. So Abner said again, by the way, second chance. That was actually kind of nice, Abner, right? He says, turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab? But he refused to turn aside. So here Asahel is continually following Abner. Abner, who is, we'd call him the bad guy, is actually doing good guy things right now, right? Like, hey, shouldn't chase me. He's still chasing him. Like, hey, stop. We've all been there. Some, they have the siblings like, stop hitting me. Stop. I'm telling you, stop. It's going to be bad, right? It's going to be bad. I'm gonna punch you if you don't go. Like, warning him. So Abner is doing the honorable thing, and he's warning him to stop. But Asahel, and his stubbornness, and his loyalty to David, and his pride, passion, and fury, he is still continuing on. He refused, it said, to turn aside. He is just beelining for him. So, therefore, Abner struck him in the stomach with the butt of his spear, so the spear came out of his back. And he fell there and died where he was. And all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. So, Abner warned him, right? Abner warned him. He tried to be honorable, didn't want to kill Asahel. And another reason I think we get more evidence of that he didn't want to kill Asahel, because look when it says Abner struck him in the stomach, what did he strike him in the stomach with? The butt of his spear. This, you know what I mean? This would be like hitting somebody with the handle of your knife. If you took your knife, face it towards you, and like, stop, get away. Kind of like holding up, like, get away, like almost like a broomstick. And because he wouldn't, it went right through his stomach. It was a defensive position. He could have spun the spear around and just killed him like he said he was going to. He was actually, seems like, fending him off. But he was so pursuing him so fiercely that it went right through him. And all the men saw this happen. That's why they stood in shock. Because they probably thought Asahel's going to kill Abner, and Abner's fighting him off, and Abner here, and as he's fighting him off, it goes right through his back and kills Asahel, and they're in shock. That's what it means. They stood, when they saw him fall down, they were in shock. Like, we did not expect this to happen. We didn't know what to do. Abner warned us. And why are they in shock? Well, one, Asahel just died, and that's not good. He was high up, right? Number two is, there's going to be more bloodshed, right? Because now, if Asahel's dead, oh my goodness, wait till David and Joab and Abishai all find out about this, right? And surely, look what happens as we go to verse 24. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner. Oh my goodness, it gets worse. So, of course, right? I mean, somebody kills your brother. You don't know the details. They weren't there. They didn't know the details. And actually, let's be honest, with the details, it doesn't matter. Well, Abner didn't. He tried not to kill him. He just put the spear. They're not going to care. That was their brother, right? So Joab and Abishai, they're his brothers. They are not happy. And as the sun was going down, they came to the hill of Ammah. As they're pursuing Abner, they're now chasing Abner to kill him. And they get to this hill of Ammah, which lies before Giah on the way to the wilderness of Gibeon. And the people of Benjamin gathered themselves. Remember, they're fighting, because that's where Saul is from. They're fighting with Saul now. And the people of Benjamin gathered themselves together behind Abner and became one group and took their stand on the top of the hill. So you can imagine they're chasing them, and they get up there, and now there's Abner. And with Abner is this army of men now behind them. That's what it says. They became one group. The people of Benjamin gathered. There's a big group of men. It's not just Abner alone. There's a whole bunch of people here with him. Then Abner called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that the end will be bitter? How long will it be before you tell your people to turn from the pursuit of their brothers?" So I love this. Abner's just killed their brother. He killed Joab's brother, and he knows it's not good. And he's saying, like, listen, I told your brother to stop. Do you guys want to come right now and fight? And he didn't say that he was going to kill all of them, wipe them out, but he knew, he was wise enough, shall the sword devour forever? Means, should we just keep going on, killing each other? Do you want to kill us and we're going to come kill you? Because we're not going to, if you kill us, we're going to end up killing you. Do you want this to go on forever and ever? And it's neat because Abner, again, we consider him somewhat of a bad guy, right? Because he's with Saul and he's not listening to God. However, Abner still has wisdom. I mean, he's a war general. He must have wisdom. God gave wisdom if he's a good leader, right? But he's showing a lot of wisdom here. He wants to protect a lot of lives because otherwise it's going to be absolutely awful of what happens. And this is what happens. You guys, I'm sure you can think of like things, little things, not like this, but how revenge always picks up, like especially with siblings. Oh, you're going to do that? Well, then I'm going to do this. Then I'm going to rip this of yours. Oh, yeah, well, then I'm going to do this. It just escalates and escalates, and it gets bigger and bigger and worse. And there's hardly ever an end to it until something bad really happens, right? And Abner had already killed their brother. He doesn't want this to go on and on. He says, you know the end will be bitter. How long will it be before you tell your people to turn from the pursuit of their brothers? And I like what he says, of their brothers. That's interesting, right? But remember, they're all Israelites. So he's saying, how long? We're going to kill ourselves. Israel will wipe ourselves out if we don't stop this. We got to knock this nonsense off. You guys can be in charge of Judah. We'll be in charge of Israel. And Joab said, as God lives, if you had not spoken, surely the men would not have given up the pursuit of their brothers until the morning. So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the men stopped and pursued Israel no more. Did they fight anymore? That's really interesting. So Joab, David's man, says, you know what, Abner? I'm actually glad you said this, because we were going to kill you. Maybe those are words of wisdom. Maybe not. If you would have done this, we wouldn't do it. But, I'm going to call it off. And he blows the trumpet, basically go home, call off the war. So Abner's wisdom actually works out here. It's kind of amazing that Joab kind of comes to his senses, knows it's going to be bad, and says, all right, we're going to stop pursuing Israel. We're not going to fight anymore. And they basically call off the war there. They knew it was going to be no good, and Abner was able to actually speak some wisdom in him, which is nice. Saved a lot of lives that day, I'll tell you that. Verse 29. And Abner and his men went all that night through the Arabah. They crossed the Jordan, and marching the whole morning, they came to Mahanaim. Joab returned from the pursuit of Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, there were missing from David's servants 19 men, besides Asahel. But the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin 360 of Abner's men. And they took up Asahel and buried him in the tomb of his father, which was at Bethlehem. And Joab and his men marched all night, and the day broke upon them at Hebron. So you see, after this battle, Abner and his men, after they agreed like this truce, all right, we're calling it off. Joab blows the trumpet. We're stopping the war, putting a pause on it. This will be a ceasefire. This is what you always hear about today. This is basically a ceasefire. It's not going to end the war. It wasn't like, all right, cool, that was done. Everybody's, we killed those guys, and the 24 guys are dead, and my brother's dead, but let's just call it off. No, it's a ceasefire. It's just a pause on the war that is going to inevitably continue because they're at civil war here. But what's interesting here is Abner and his men are traveling all night to go home, and we saw that Joab and his men, they traveled, and the day broke upon that Hebron, so they made it home safe, right? They all made it home safe. But we learned some key details here. There were missing from David's servants 19 men besides Asahel. So that means 19 plus 1 is 20. So David had 20 men die, not just those 12, right? So we just learned about those 12 men die in the beginning, and Asahel 13. So along the way, we didn't read about it, but 7 other guys of David's men got killed in this war. But look what it says below that. But the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin 360 of Abner's men, which is basically Saul's guys. 360. So David's lost 20 guys, Abner lost 360. If you do the math, that's David lost 1 guy for every 18 that Abner lost. So David loses 1, Abner loses 18. David loses 1, Abner loses 18. That's why it's so lopsided here. So David, that's why earlier it said after that, where is it at? After he killed Asahel, the battle was very fierce that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. It kind of preliminary listed that, and now we're reading about the actual numbers of that. So that meant the war went on. After those 12, people were fighting all kinds of chaos. 360 guys died. So we only read about 12, right? We only read about 12 being killed. So there was many more killed that wasn't written in here. But what this is showing us is although there is a civil war going on, God's plan is unfolding. Because clearly, I mean, if this is a war of attrition, like, look at this. If you lost 360, we're playing a game, you lose 360 players in dodgeball, and I lose 20. I am gaining strength. You are getting weaker. I am getting stronger is kind of the situation. It's starting to get tilted my way, right? That's what was happening. You can see here, God is promised that David would be king, and we're seeing here that he is going to win this war. It is tilting in David's favor pretty quickly right out the gate. Now, it's going to last, like I said, 2 years here, and we're going to learn about more. There's just going to be more bloodshed and more death over this, and that's what we learn here, that with these kind of wars, that's very dangerous from human pride and arrogance. That's really, again, why Abner's doing all this. Abner, again, could have just conceded and been part of Judah, but because of his pride and self-ambition and ignoring God, it led to a lot of killing, a lot of death, and you'll see it even leads to his later on. But you can see here God still being faithful, even through these wars. I'm sure David, when he got the numbers, said, all right, the Lord is surely on my side. It's not good right now, but we're just going to be patient and hang with the Lord. And that's how 2 Samuel chapter 2 ends. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts based on what we just went over and what we just read? Beard.
Yeah, so I was looking ahead in chapter 23, and it lists David's mighty men.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that Asahel is one of those, because the setting for that chapter is, like, David is already king, he's ready to build a temple, all this stuff. Like,
Yeah.
the end of his life, but Asahel obviously just died.
Yeah.
So, like, do you think this list of mighty men is
current
a built-up army towards the end, when really it seems like it's a list of people who had served alongside him throughout his whole life, and not like at one point in time there were all 37 of the 30 mighty men, because
Right.
37 listed. Yeah, so I found that interesting.
That's a really great observation. You'll read about his mighty men. We'll get to that in probably months. That's at the rate we're going now. But that'll be later in the book. But what he's saying is right. Asahel's listed in that. Which, if you did, that's why it's so good to read the Bible in order, so you know when we get to there that he's dead. Because what he's saying here, he made a discovery. It's more like those war walls, like the memorials. When you go down, you see all the men that fought. Right. So it'd be like, this is our mighty men of World War II, and we list all the names right now in the newspaper or something like that. We all know they're not alive now, but they were the mighty warriors that are the reason that our country is strong and why we're here today. And that's what we'll see at the end. When it lists his mighty men, it's saying this is the reason that David is king. These are the men that the Lord used to fight for the freedom of the Israel and Judah and to unite them. That's a really great observation, Beard. Again, another reason why it's cool to read the Bible in context. Otherwise, you would read that and say, wait a minute, if you didn't read this chapter, you'd say, no, Asahel's not dead. He's one of the mighty men at the end of 2 Samuel. But you'd say, oh, well, it's kind of like a memorial kind of a situation. So, great find, Beard. Anybody else have any questions or thoughts based on this chapter or anything we talked about? All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. Make sure to read ahead. 2 Samuel chapter 3 will be in next week. It'll continue on in the chaos of the story. But have a blessed week. Until then, keep your lamps trimmed and burning.